Hello, and welcome everyone once again to our first We Are the Builders study group again for 2022. And I'd like to acknowledge that we're broadcasting from various lands, First Nations lands, and I'd like to acknowledge from the land I'm on, the Jar Jar Wurrung, and its elders past, present, and future, and acknowledge that their struggle is obviously an ongoing struggle for land against colonialism and imperialism, which is the main contradiction in the world today. And I'd like to welcome Joe and Helen once again, my comrades in arms here. Joe, how are you today?
Very good.
And
Yeah, ready to roll.
also, I'd like to say, how are you today, Helen?
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Dave. Thanks. Glad to be
Yeah.
back.
Yeah, no, it's been we had a good break over Christmas and we did a great New Year period. It's nice to have some time off, and obviously we're back right into the struggle for the year. To also acknowledge too, it's been very hot and humid as well. So we're just going to be aware with the heat. But look, for tonight, we are now on a new book. We're going to be studying some sections from Mao Zedong on New Democracy. Obviously, this flows from discussions we've had from what we were just studying last year about Peru Libre, and also we are City Builders Study Guide and what democracy is. So obviously we're studying for some classics as well and some contemporary stuff. For this one, we're going to be starting from chapter 5 because the first four chapters are more or less pertaining to China. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the book, it's from Mao Zedong Selected Works, Volume 2, on page 339. It usually starts the whole chapter for the whole section. But we're going to start from chapter 5, the politics of a new democracy, and we'll be reading a page each, and we'll be reading the next three chapters. So that will allow us then chapters 5, 6, and 7. And this will allow us then to have the ability to have discussion too through it. And look, for any viewers out there, please feel free that are coming on board. I'll ask is feel free to throw a question in there anytime or any comment we might be able to address as well. And so what we'll do, well, Joe, I'll start with you first. If you want to kick it off, chapter 5. You're on mute, Joe.
I was live, then I muted myself. Anyway, right there. The politics of new democracy. The new historical characteristics of the Chinese Revolution is its division into two stages. The first being the new democratic revolution. How does this manifest itself concretely in internal political and economic relations? Let us consider the question. Before the May 4th movement of 1919, which occurred after the First Imperialist World War of 1914 and the Russian October Revolution of 1917, the petty bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie, although they're intellectuals, through their intellectuals, I should say, were the political leaders of the bourgeois democratic revolution. The Chinese proletariat had not yet appeared on the political scene as an awakened and independent class force, but participated in the revolution only as a follower of the petty bourgeoisie and bourgeoisie. Such was the case with the proletariat at the time of the revolution of 1911. After the May 4th movement, the political leader of China's bourgeois democratic revolution was no longer the bourgeoisie but the proletariat. Although the national bourgeoisie continued to take part in the revolution, the Chinese proletariat rapidly became an awakened and independent political force as a result of its maturing and of the influence of the Russian Revolution. It was the Chinese Communist Party that put forward the slogan, "Down with imperialism," and the thoroughgoing program for the whole bourgeois democratic revolution. It was the Chinese Communist Party alone that carried out the agrarian revolution. Being a bourgeoisie in a colonial and semi-colonial country and oppressed by imperialism, the Chinese national bourgeoisie retains a certain revolutionary quality at certain periods and to a certain degree, even in the era of imperialism. In its opposition to foreign imperialism and the democratic government of bureaucrats and warlords, Instances of opposition to the latter can be found in the periods of the Revolution of 1911 and the Northern Expedition. And it may ally itself with the proletariat and the petty bourgeoisie against such enemies as it is ready to oppose. In this respect, the Chinese bourgeoisie differs from the bourgeoisie of old Tsarist Russia, since Tsarist Russia was a military feudal imperialism which carried on aggression against other countries. The Russian bourgeoisie was entirely lacking in revolutionary quality. There, the task of the proletariat was to oppose the bourgeoisie and not to unite with it. But China's national bourgeoisie has a revolutionary quality at certain periods and to a certain degree, because China is a colonial and semi-colonial country which is a victim of aggression. Here, the task of the proletariat is to form a united front with the national bourgeoisie against imperialism and against the bureaucrat and warlord government without overlooking its revolutionary quality. So that's a page. Do we want to say a few words about this little section? Because I think there
Sure.
are some
Sure.
similarities and some differences.
Sure. Just before we move on, look, welcome Nada, and also I believe Janet Woolley's Jan Woolley's involved as well. We can't connect her at the moment because she doesn't have a camera and mic. But welcome, Jan, if you're watching this. And yeah, and just for Nada as information, we're starting from chapter 5 on New Democracy, Mao Zedong, and that was on page 347. So we just finished reading the first page. We're just having a quick discussion.
Yeah, I found it. I'm following.
Yep. Cool. Yeah. Sorry, Joe.
Yeah. So if we start on that, I mean, there's a couple of key points there, and that's the nature of analysis of the class structure of Chinese society. And in that case, there was a stage of the bourgeois democratic revolution where the sections of the capitalist class had a progressive characteristics because they were also oppressed by imperialism in their way. So their interests were denied by the presence of imperialism in China, foreign imperialism. So there is that. How does that relate to Australia? And there's also the semi-colonial and semi-feudal nature of Chinese society. Well, ours is not semi-feudal, in a sense, not quite semi-colonial, but there are elements of it here. And I think if we talked in the past, the unfinished tasks that began, well, even before, but it was a highlight during the Eureka Rebellion of 1856 and the subsequent history. And there's still some way to go. I mean, it's not the big thing, but symbols of it are that we have, or big symbol, we still got the Queen of the UK as the head of state. So is there a section of capitalism that has some progressive characteristics or potentially progressive characteristics? And I would argue yes, and we've seen this in the past. Perhaps in the question of the Republic, there are some people from that quarter who reckon, yeah, we should be independent from Britain. We should be independent from other places. And we really have to look at those who are being squeezed by the corporations, the multinational corporations of imperialism, who are actually being put out of existence or have been. There's been a process of that. Now, what comes to mind is what's left of the manufacturing industry here. Is there in some sections of the manufacturing industry, those who own what's left, a progressive element that they also want a freeing up of the Australian economy to actually rebuild manufacturing? So maybe we can see that in other areas.
I think the possibility of certainly forming alliances with elements of our small producing class, our small factories, our small engineering firms, our small, even to some extent, retail outlets and so on. Certainly we can form alliances with them, because we know that, the market forces will exist even under socialism. And so those market forces are being squeezed by the big multinational corporations, even suppliers to the likes of McDonald's, those small farmers that are being squeezed to produce their meat and produce their food at basically at cost price, and then sell it to, and sell it for less than probably what they're even producing it for. So they're being squeezed more and more, is what I'm trying to say. And so therefore, an alliance with the revolutionary class, or with an idea of a new way of doing things, is, we could see that it's possible to form those alliances. And I think that's going to be an important role for us to fulfill as well.
Yeah, as far as like the way that the working class has changed and evolved in Australia, we can see that with the amount of small proprietors, people who just like own their own, like small tradesmen who don't really formally work for a big company, but have their own small enterprise basically, and those are not they're not the enemy. Yeah, and I agree. It's also the matter of like what's the relationship of any individual class to the monopolies, to the cartels, basically. Where do they line? Where do their spontaneous class interests align? Do they spontaneously arise against the monopolies, or do they more for them? And then I think the distinction when it comes to the petty bourgeois, there's two sides, right? There's the working petty bourgeois, and then there's the more institutionalized, professional, managerial petty bourgeois, and they have more institutional interests that are aligned with those monopolies, and that's why they tend to be the most fervent in defending, the most reactionary, I suppose, elements, who are the most interested in defending the status quo, effectively. Whereas there's more like a downwardly mobile, working petty bourgeoisie, and they are definitely a very large section of the population who's going to be allied with. And you're right about the agricultural small farmers, effectively, compared to the large agribusiness. So yeah.
Just could I add there? I mean, there are a few examples, and I think it was alluded to slightly. There's the retail sector. I mean, you've got a lot of small and some reasonably sized who are really, for decades now, been squeezed out by two mainly monopoly supermarket chains, who actually are owned by big banks' overseas interests. You've got other areas now. I know two areas with contact, and they were fairly sized businesses. One was actually a family-run, been for at least 3 generations, undertakers, and they were being squeezed out. And a fellow talked to me, said how this mob from the United States came and was actually undercutting all the undertakers and making them all go out of business. Another one was a fellow who owned a sportswear shop, who explained how Rebel was coming against another big monopoly coming in and really knocking them all out of the water one by one. He's gone now, but there were a lot more. So there are those elements. Even though, I mean, those two, for instance, employed a whole bunch of workers, and they did, what employers do, but they wanted help. And they were prepared to get help and cut any deal from anybody who would give them help. And we may be going into a peak of that era as with COVID, but the general crisis that's happening with more facing the wall, even large organisations facing the wall, saying, where can we get some help? So that's, I think, what Mao was talking about, that sort of thing in China, where where that they copped it really severely, that for these sections of the bourgeoisie there was actually no other choice.
I was just going to say too, it was interesting. A few years ago, the last state election, I was living up in Wodonga at the time, northeast of Victoria, and on the state election, I was having an interesting discussion at a polling booth with one person actually working. Well, he's not a member of the Liberal Party. He was a small proprietor. Just happened to earn some extra cash for that day. Another person that was handing out, I think she was supporting some independent. She was a dairy. And they were looking to form a co-op and stuff. But we actually wound up being in a general discussion about things. And obviously, I like to see it from a working class point of view. And and I said, well, don't you actually think the common enemy we've got is big finance? They seem to be the ones that want to take over the cooperatives, which you guys have set up, seem to push the poor farmer off the land, dictate prices. And et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And like they're trying at the same time crush wages and conditions. Don't you think we've actually got something in common here? And they actually thought for a minute, and they thought, yeah, actually we do. We do a link on that. So somehow there was that sort of economic, even though it might be small, might be large, whatever, or even temporary. There's that interest, and I thought, hang on, we're seeing a focus on. It's not a matter about a worker between a farmer or a worker between a small business. No, this seems to be. This is big capital we're up against. I didn't put it in those words to them, but I just feel like I just put big finance and that. They got that, what I was talking about, big banks, etc., because they're right at the forefront of it. And so, I mean, we've got something to tap into there in Australia.
Sorry.
I think that's the key, is that it's the banking system that is going to destroy small size business and so on, and just like they cripple the workers in terms of our mortgages and debts and so on, they're going to cripple small business as well. And so, and I think in the Chinese situation, while they could form alliances, they could do that because they had a foreign invader, and so they had Japan in there as a foreign invader. It's very easy to see your enemy when they're the invader. You can see your enemy. You can unite against that enemy. It's harder for us to see our enemy and be united against it. But the banks are our enemy. They're the ones that are, like I said earlier, they're the ones that are going to cripple ordinary people and cripple small business. So maybe it will be easy to form alliances on that basis. Like you said, Dave, you had discussions that were showing that people were able to make that connection, that we have the similar, or we have exactly the same enemy. But I think our our stages are different in that, because we're not a semi-feudal and we're not a colonial country, although we have elements of that, of course. The steps that we'll go through, or the stages that we go through, will be slightly different than China's. And I don't think we need to spend a lot of time trying to form alliances with those, those small businesses and so on, because we're not going to go through that stage. We're going to go to socialism. Will be our next stage, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think we can't jump too far ahead. Certainly, we talk about in principle, if there's ever an opportunity. The bottom line is the capability of actually delivering something. Our movement's not in that position at the moment. Although in our conversation, I could imagine one or two people who I've known who'd be running off, screaming loudly, class collaboration stuff. And it's not. The question of alliance does not mean the surrender of principle necessarily. I mean, some people can do that anyway. It means that you reach an agreement where both sides bargain, put their key issues on the table. So, right, we will offer a concession in return for this. So in that sense, if you're going to formalise, that's what's happened, and that's what you fight for. So the reality is a movement against imperialism, like in the question, like in the situation there, and he said that in the chat part I yelled out. It moved forward when the working class took leadership, and that's really the key question. It's not surrendering leadership. is achieving leadership and saying, righto, we can strike this deal, which suits both sides, right? We can fight together.
Yeah, just before we move on, I just wanted to say that there's something kind of funny about the accusation of class collaboration, because you could argue that's what the Bolsheviks were, right? It was between the workers and the peasants. That's a kind of class collaboration in a sense, but at the same time, even then, they made clear distinctions between like the middle peasant and like the kulak, you know? So even then, you know, like, yeah, it's a silly kind of position because it doesn't take into account what are the real premises and what are the real like actual interests involved in as it is right now and how things are right now. And you're right. Ultimately, yes, the working class has to be in charge effectively. But at the same time, you can't necessarily use that to just be like, well, you know, we're going to go at it alone. It's like that's not how it works, you know. Like Australia, and you mentioned the colonial elements, Helen. It's true. We have like it is accurate to say that we have semi-colonial elements. So that is something that we have to, I suppose, as communists, we have to do the concrete analysis first before, like any strategy, any political strategy follows from an analysis of real conditions. It doesn't. We don't premise it based on our ideology, you know.
All right. Well, look, what we'll do, comrades, we'll continue on. Just we're in time. Helen, did you want to kick off the next page, please? You're on mute.
Helen,
Sorry.
you're on mute.
Sorry. Where did we finish up from?
We're up to at the same time.
Third line down at the same time.
Okay, thank you. At the same time, however, being a bourgeois class in a colonial and semi-colonial country, and so being extremely flabby economically and politically, the Chinese national bourgeoisie has another quality, namely a proneness to conciliation with the enemy of the revolution. Even when it takes part in the revolution, it is unwilling to break with imperialism completely, and moreover, it is closely associated with the exploitation of the rural areas through land rent. Thus, it is neither willing nor able to overthrow imperialism, and much less the feudal forces in a thorough way. So neither of the two basic problems or tasks of China's bourgeois democratic revolution can be solved or accomplished by the national bourgeoisie. As for China's big bourgeoisie, which is represented by the Kuomintang, all through the long period from 1927 to 1937, it nestled in the arms of the imperialist and formed an alliance with the feudal forces against the revolutionary people. In 1927 and for some time afterwards, the Chinese national bourgeoisie also followed the counter-revolution. During the present anti-Japanese war, the section of the big bourgeoisie represented by Wang Qingwei has capitulated to the enemy, which constitutes a fresh betrayal on the part of the big bourgeoisie. In this respect, then, the bourgeoisie in China differs from the earlier bourgeoisie of the European and American countries, and especially of France. When the bourgeoisie in those countries, and especially in France, was still in its revolutionary era, the bourgeois revolution was comparatively thorough, whereas the bourgeoisie in China lacks even this degree of thoroughness. Possible participation in the revolution on the one hand, and proneness to conciliation with the enemies of the revolution on the other, such as the dual character of the Chinese bourgeoisie. It faces both ways. Even the bourgeoisie in European and American history had shared this dual character. When confronted by a formidable enemy, they united with the workers and peasants against him. But when the workers and peasants awakened, they turned around to unite with the enemy against the peasants and workers. This is a general rule applicable to the bourgeoisie everywhere in the world, but the trait is more pronounced in the Chinese bourgeoisie. In China, it is perfectly clear that whoever can lead the people in overthrowing imperialism and the forces of feudalism can win the people's confidence, because these two, and especially imperialism, are the mortal enemies of the people. Today, whoever can lead the people in driving out Japanese imperialism and introducing democratic government will be the saviors of the people. History has proved that Chinese bourgeoisie cannot fulfill this responsibility, which inevitably falls upon the shoulders of the proletariat. Therefore, the proletariat, the peasantry, the intelligentsia, and the other sections of the petty bourgeoisie undoubtedly constitute the basic forces determining China's fate. These classes, some already awakened and others in the process of awakening, will necessarily become the basic components of the state and governmental structure in the Democratic Republic of China, with the proletariat as the leading force. The Chinese Democratic Republic, which we desire to establish now, must be a democratic republic under the joint dictatorship of all anti-imperialist and anti-feudal people led by the proletariat. That is a new democratic republic, a republic of the genuinely revolutionary new three people's principle with their three great policies. This new democratic...
Yeah, I was
this
sorry,
is
Helen.
pro-
I was trying
Yeah.
to jump on unmute. I think it explains actually. It's really good to explain the role of the various class forces here, because they alone are incapable of actually dealing with this. If we just leave it to the small business, the small proprietor, even to the medium-sized business to take on the system, well, it still has to depend on the system to a certain degree for its survival as well. So they can't actually overpower. Where they're talking about, where what Mar's talking about here was actually talking about the leading role of the working class in this as well. And also too, just for viewers, so when you hear the term joint dictatorship or dictatorship of the proletariat, it's not like a one person giving all this rule and dictating. It's not. It actually means rule of the working class. And what he's saying there is, by joint means a joint with the working class and other allies in the struggle against imperialism and establishing a new society. So that's what they meant by that. But I think it just comes to show you that the working class has to play the leading role in it. And I suppose, I looked at in Australia here, in Australia's recent history, I mean, where things have been example, the working class hasn't just been the driving force, it's been in the leading force. The Vietnam moratoriums, many other struggles out there, right up through in the recent times, wherever any movement or campaign's been successful, is because there was working class has been in the leadership of it, not being on the behind, or just seem to be tailing at the end of it. So it's something just to keep the back of our mind. So if something to be successful, then the working class has got to be playing the leading role here.
Yeah, he also, in those paragraphs, introduces really the idea of new democracy in there, that it's a revolutionary change. It's not a cosmetic change. And in that, there is a shared, in a sense, what he says, leading role of the working class, but there's a shared power at the same time. Although that's dominant, but some authority is given to allies of that struggle. And that's the position to take it. We relate it to Australia. I mean, what Helen said before about the banks is true. And if you look at any business, even really big ones, that they are in hock. They are generally in big debt to the banks because they operate on the basis of credit, and they're always owing more than they're earning. So even though their owners might take home a big pay, they don't really properly control their businesses, because if something goes wrong, the bank forecloses on them, right? And so in a climate of competition, and where the economy is going down and the weaker fall out of the picture, well, they're going to go sooner or later. So they will want some. What's important, I think, in this, to win over those forces, the working class must be able to show its strength, its capability of being the force that can look after society.
Yeah, and also just to first of all, the three people's principles for anyone who isn't aware in chat, it's from Sun Yat-sen, which is nationalism, democracy, and the livelihood of the people. And that was sort of like where both the Kuomintang and the communists, it's like the communists were the ones who were able to prove that they could actually follow through on that, basically. But also, what I wanted to mention was in contemporary China, how we see the crackdown on people like Jack Ma, like the party, the control of the proletariat is still there, and they still are there to like those elements, like it was mentioned that that bourgeois class as an ally is still, it's not trustworthy. So um, and so even then they're still very aware of that, and that's sort of what she represents. So yeah.
Yeah, I came across something today which I read it's in the same city that Jack Ma is, and there's another bloke. There's a new law there, and he's just been charged with the crime of reckless investment, which meant ripping off people big time. so that's become illegal now, officially.
Fair enough. Well, look, just continuing on, further discussions. Nada, are you able to take over for probably just finish up the next page and a half? Have you got the copy there? Yeah, right.
Yeah, got it.
We're I think the paragraph, the New Democratic Republic, but I'll read down to pretty much that bit in the next page. Yep.
All right. This new democratic republic will be different from the old European American form of capitalist republic under bourgeois dictatorship, which is the old democratic form and already out of date. On the other hand, it will also be different from the socialist republic of the Soviet type under the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is already flourishing in the USSR, and which, moreover, will be established in all the capitalist countries and will undoubtedly become the dominant form of state and governmental structure in all the industrially advanced countries. However, for a certain historical period, this form is not suitable. This form is not suitable for the revolutions in the colonial and semi-colonial countries. During this period, therefore, a third form of state must be adopted in the revolutions of all colonial and semi-colonial countries, namely the new democratic republic. This form suits a certain historical period and is therefore transitional. Nevertheless, it is a form which is necessary and cannot be dispensed with. Thus, the numerous types of state systems in the world can be reduced to three basic kinds according to the class character of their political power. 1. Republics under bourgeois dictatorship. 2. Republics under the dictatorship of the proletariat. And 3. Republics under the joint dictatorship of several revolutionary classes. The first kind comprises the old democratic states. Today, after the outbreak of the Second Imperialist War, there is hardly a trace of democracy in many of the capitalist countries, which have come or are coming under the bloody militarist dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Certain countries under the joint dictatorship of the landlords and the bourgeoisie can be grouped with this kind. The second kind exists in the Soviet Union, and the conditions for its birth are ripening in capitalist countries. In the future, it will be the dominant form throughout the world for a certain period. The third kind is the transitional form of state to be adopted in the revolutions of the colonial and semi-colonial countries. Each of these revolutions will necessarily have specific characteristics of its own, but these will be minor variations on a general theme. So long as they are revolutions in colonial or semi-colonial countries, their state and governmental structure will of necessity be basically the same, i.e. a new democratic state under the joint dictatorship of several anti-imperialist classes. In present-day China, the anti-Japanese United Front represents the new democratic form of state. It is anti-Japanese and anti-imperialist. It is also a united front, and an alliance of several revolutionary classes. But unfortunately, despite the fact that the war has been going on for so long, the work of introducing democracy has hardly started in most of the country, as outside the democratic anti-Japanese base areas under the leadership of the Communist Party. And the Japanese imperialists have exploited this fundamental weakness to stride into our country. If nothing is done about it, our national future will be gravely imperiled. The question under discussion here is that of the state system. After several decades of wrangling since the last years of the Qing dynasty, Qing dynasty. It has still not been cleared up. Actually, it is simply a question of the status of the various social classes within the state. The bourgeoisie, as a rule, conceals the problem of class status and carries out its one-class dictatorship under the national label. Such concealment is of no advantage to the revolutionary people, and the matter should be clearly explained to them. The term national is all right, but it must not include counter-revolutionaries and traitors. The kind of state we need today is a dictatorship of the revolutionary classes over the counter-revolutionaries and traitors. The so-called democratic system in modern states is usually monopolized by the bourgeoisie and has become simply an instrument for oppressing the common people. On the other hand, the Kuomintang's principle of democracy means a democratic system shared by all the common people and not privately owned by a few. Such was the solemn declaration made in the manifesto of the First National Congress of the Kuomintang, held in 1924 during the period of Kuomintang Communist Corporation. For 16 years, the Kuomintang has violated this declaration, and as a result, it has created the present grave national crisis. This is a gross blunder, which we hope the Kuomintang will correct in the cleansing flames of the anti-Japanese war.
All right. Thanks for that. Now, okay, well, I'll open up this little section before we finish off that section. Continue on. Anyone's got any comment on that one?
Yeah,
I think.
I'll go first.
Helen, you
Sorry.
go first. Oh, who was going first? Oh, Helen, you're on mute. I'll unmute you. Hang on.
No, there's a lot of stuff and there's a lot of information in there, and on the one hand it seems to be saying one thing, and then on the other hand it seems to be saying something else, and it can be quite confusing as to what they're saying. So I think if we take it back to the beginning and just try to clarify on the one hand, he says that we want this type of revolution. Then on the other hand, he's saying, but because of the traders, we need this kind of revolution. So maybe we can explain that a bit further.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of bit, and I think in hindsight from that, I mean, we're talking about the context of 1940, and we're talking about conditions of the Second World War, and really the rise of fascism in Europe and so on. But also with the USSR, I think there's a small error, which history, I think, has shown, is that, and more information got out from there, because in the October Revolution after, there was an alliance with sections of the bourgeoisie and that, so that kind of has been a bit overlooked. There were business operators and millionaires, even some of them even donated to the Bolsheviks. Because they were more against the other lot. So I mean that's the reality there. And they had the NEP in the early 1920s in the Soviet Union, again where that alliance was formalised. So for people who don't know that, the new economic policy, which was a united front there, so there was that sort of three types of society, of state or political power, is probably not quite as neat as those three categories. I mean, they're good for an explanation of the different kinds of be, but in real life, it's a bit more complicated. And in Europe, in Western countries, I should say, because it includes Europe, the United States, and countries like Australia, we have learned since then it's not quite so simple. It's a bit more complicated. There's a process there to go through, and there's the need to build certain forms of united front. It varies from country to country, but it's common to all countries. So there is that side, and I think some of the thing about the instability of some of the allies is very true. Again, it depends who appears to be the strongest at the time. Often who can actually offer the most, shall we say, the most protection. But there is also the thing that in China, I think Helen said before, the clear-cut thing of at that time the Japanese had sent an army in there, and they were bombing and shooting people and all sorts of things. So that made the situation really clear at that time. Because we know from the history, even in that condition, that when we're talking about Kuomintang, that they were not that reliable. And after Sun Yat-sen died and Chiang Kai-shek took over, it all went downhill from there. And they actually jumped sides. They didn't exactly ally formally with the Japanese, but they did nothing in the Japanese resistance.
Nada, sorry.
Yeah, no. One thing that I noted was just like you can definitely tell it was written in the 40s because it says like the kind of system that the Soviet Union had was going to become the dominant form, and that obviously did not happen. I mean, it did expand into Eastern Europe following the Second Imperialist War, but this was definitely something that was not anticipated by Mao, of course. So just to note that. And also, the other thing that was mentioned was, where was it? I'm trying to find it. That the democracy was only being carried out by the communists, that it wasn't being done by the nationalists, which is true. And also why the strongest areas in the fight against the Japanese were the communists. It's ultimately why they won after the war as well, because they proved to the Chinese people themselves through their practice that they were the most capable of actually winning. And so, yeah, I don't know.
There's just one part that I wanted to pick up on, and that was his description of democracies, and he described them as three different types, and one's the republics under bourgeois dictatorship. That's the kind of democracy that we live under here in Australia. Two republics under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Again, he was talking about the Soviet Union, and republics under the joint dictatorship of several revolutionary classes. And I just wanted to kind of draw attention to the fact that democracy is not something that is fixed or static. It means lots of different things under lots of different circumstances. And that's important for us to understand because, in our mainstream media, they paint democracy as only one thing. And that is the type of democracy that we have in Australia, or that America has, and that Britain has. And that's the only kind of democracy that's true democracy. And they peddle it out to us all of the time as though when we go to elections every 4 years, that's the only type of democracy there is, and our way of life is democratic and so on. But as Mao's pointing out, there are different forms of democracies, and of course what we want to now encourage people to think about is what's another type of democracy that's going to lead us forward? What's another type of democracy that means that we can be that we can have a say in what's happening in our factories, or we can have a say in what's happening in our workplace, and our workplaces can become more productive, and we can be more involved in it, and we can be remunerated in such a way as that we're sharing in the wealth and so on. And we definitely don't have that type of democracy in our country at the moment. So I think that was an important point, and something that we need to elaborate on, at some other point in time.
Yeah, and I just want to elaborate too. Democracy is wound up in the means of production as well. It is tied to it. It's not separate from it as well. We live under a system where profits are in command, and it's capitalism where we're trying to strive for a higher form of economic system where all the major banks, industries, etc., all organised around a central plan and in the benefit of the public good. So that's which is a higher form of economic model, which we all no doubt is a socialism word.
Yeah.
But, and I think that's something that's widely for, and I think I'm glad Chairman Mao actually did raise this interesting point right through this whole thing, because when I've said asked about when people asked about freedom and all this was how can you be freedom if you're losing your job and you're only 2 paychecks from complete poverty? You can't go to work and tell your boss what you even think of him all that time, or you lose your job. It's just like it's. Someone wrote something. Don't forget what they called Australia one time, but it's interesting where people think, we're truly democratic and all this. Well, you might be able to easily tell a politician to get stuffed at times, but that's about as far as it goes. It doesn't actually mean we've got actually control of the outcome either, and that's got to comes down to the relative strength of the classes involved. And I think it's vitally important it is the relative strength of the classes involved in the struggle to achieve a higher form of economic model, etc. So that's it's something to keep in mind. Look, what I'll do, I'll continue. Yeah, sorry.
Can I just mention one more observation back, because Helen pointed that out to me, but maybe not on purpose, but that and it's important. Australia doesn't fall into those three models quite neatly enough into any of them, because we do have, and we've got to recognise that we're not Europe. We do have a colonial history, and there are elements that push us almost into the third model. We're not quite there either. We're somewhere in between. So we've got to find a very unique path.
Yeah, that's true, because he's talking about republics, and that's like the question that we have, is that we don't have the republic. So yeah, like you're right, Joe. We do have this sort of like, we're in this very strange position, which I think is why the original people who were trying to apply Mao Zedong thought to Australia, like with the CPA ML, they actually did come to the conclusion that we kind of do fall into that third category of being semi-colonial. And I think that there is a lot of truth to that. I mean, I don't know how true it is, but there's definitely truth to it, And even then, Australia's always been a bit of an enigma, a bit of a kind of interesting.
Well, there's more, because we're also, take our connection with economic connection with the rest of the world. We take the form of being used primarily as an exporter of raw materials.
Yeah.
Like countries in South America and Africa. Politically, we're seen as a vassal of powerful states. So we do have those characteristics.
Yeah, and it could be argued that, we do have also like our leadership, our bourgeoisie, they are like compradors, to use the more Maoist lingo, for those vassal, those bigger imperialists. So really, like, again, I think I really understand why the people who were applying Mao's thought to Australia came to that conclusion, because it really does line up. And the raw material extraction is a huge factor. Like, just because there's wealth in this country, there are people who have money, that doesn't actually mean anything in terms of the actual way that the system is, way that the economy in a macro sense is established and how it relates to the rest of the world economy. Like, being wealthy doesn't actually mean anything necessarily. We're not an industrial powerhouse. We don't have we're not like an advanced industrial capitalist country in the way that they were referring to the West back then. The world's changed a lot since then as well, but the post World War II order and the post 70s crisis of the 70s, we have to consider that we're just reading from this particular historical perspective, but when we're applying the insight of Mao to Australia, we have to consider the entire development of capitalism since then, and in particular when it comes to Australia and the relationship to the world's economic system. So yeah.
Exactly.
I beg to differ. I beg to disagree, kind of with both you and Joe, Nada, and I think that Australia is the first category. Sure, we might have some a bit of an enigma there, or and maybe we're not a republic, but so much of the world is also not a republic as. But that doesn't mean that they fall into that third category either. And maybe there's a fourth category that Mao didn't come up with. But I don't think things have changed that greatly since Mao's time. that that there's a whole new fourth category of types of democracies that exist. So yeah, I think we're open to a lot of discussion, but I think it's important also that we don't try to slot ourselves into things so that we can then fit into something that suits what we want to, stages that maybe we want to go through and so on. I think yeah, but I
Yeah,
think to
yeah,
differ
I
on
think
that
the
issue.
argument is not that we are the third category. I think the argument is that we don't quite fit into any of them. You
Yeah,
know,
Yeah,
we have
interesting.
characteristics of them. We have characteristics of them.
well, there are aspects of the first. There are aspects probably of all three of them in Australia. And where are we? That's what we've got to work out. And not us for, but that's what it's. Working class Australia's got to work out, and those who wish to lead.
I will say though, like things have changed a lot in the sense that like we're talking about like these are just like these aren't set in stone like forms that are just like eternal. These were just from their point of view in their historical circumstances that was accurate. Um, Obviously, like the whole point is just to kind of take it as insight into how to look at what it is now. Because ultimately, we have um, we have to do our own analysis of our own conditions first before we're not trying to match it onto some kind of uh, textual definition. Like that's not how we work. We start from the material premises as they exist, and we go from there. We don't try to like fit it into any kind of like predefined form of first type, third type, whatever. I think that's a bit narrow in thinking. You have to think like materialists, I guess.
Comrades, this is a great discussion actually, but I'm just also wary about time too. It's something too, but this is really fantastic stuff we're talking about now. I'll finish this off, and then we'll talk a little bit further. And then we'll continue on through chapter 6. And it goes, as for the question of the system of government, this is a matter of how political power is organised, the form in which one social class or another chooses to arrange its apparatus of political power to oppose its enemies and protect itself. There is no state which does not have an appropriate apparatus of political power to represent it. I'll repeat that again. There is no state which does not have an appropriate apparatus of political power to represent it. China may now adopt a system of people's congresses, from the National People's Congress down to the provincial, county, district and township people's congresses, with all levels electing their respective governmental bodies. But if there is to be a proper representation for each revolutionary class according to its status in the state, a proper expression of the people's will, a proper direction for revolutionary struggles, and a proper manifestation of the spirit of new democracy, then a system of really universal and equal suffrage, irrespective of sex, creed, property, or education, must be introduced. Such is the system of democratic centralism. Only a government based on democratic centralism can fully express the will of all the revolutionary people and fight the enemies of the revolution most effectively. There must be a spirit of refusal to be privately owned by the few. I'll put that, privately owned by the few, in the government and the army. Without a genuinely democratic system, this cannot be attained, and the system of government and the state system will be out of harmony. The state system, the joint dictatorship of all the revolutionary classes, and the system of government, democratic centralism, these constitute the politics of new democracy, the republic of new democracy, the republic of anti-Japanese united front, the republic of the new three people's principles with their three great policies, the Republic of China in reality as well as in name. Today, we have the Republic of China, or the People's Democratic Republic of China in name, but not in reality. And our present task is to create the reality that will fit the name. Such are the internal political relations with a revolutionary China, a China fighting Japanese aggression, should and must establish without fail. Such is the orientation, and only correct orientation, for our present work of national reconstruction. Just to make a comment, I mentioned People's Republic of China, and of course, when I read that, just reading through it, I thought, oh no, I'll get that, because they were still fighting Japanese forces and other reactionary forces. So But I mean, they got rid of the I think it was the Qing dynasty, and became the Republic of China. But it wasn't truly a People's Republic until after 1949 they consolidated it and put that in. So I just do a little bit of do apologise for that little error there. I was just seeing where that goes to, but it's interesting. Just on that, Taiwan, which is not a separate country of China, calls themselves Republic of China. All the media hyping about Taiwan and all this, that was always part of China. It's actually both forces. The old Kuomintang, which still runs it, believes in the one China policy. They just see it in a bourgeois nationalist, or a bourgeois democratic society where the communists believed in a people's democracy. So that's the fundamental difference that we've got there. But it's good. It was interesting how that was put there, quite simply about it. And that's again, I do apologise for making that little error, but I thought that was something. Just take a good little. That was just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, if we could just mention something, just quickly before we go on, and that's the term democratic centralism, and I think there's a lot of confusion about that, and sometimes people interpret it, that's the opposite to democracy. It's actually not particularly socialist. It's really what the two words say. There's democracy and there's centralism. There's democracy in the process of decision making, and there's centralism in the administration of those decisions. Actually carrying out. In other words, that's how every committee, a union, community organisation, political party works. They're working properly. The members make the decisions, and they elect certain people into leadership, and their role effectively is to organise the carrying out of these decisions. And so sometimes when it gets confused, it kind of gets inverted, where the leaders make all the decisions, and the base advises them. That's feudalism, basically. That's what happened then, and so we need to be clear on this, that we're talking about, when we're talking about in the form of a state, we're talking about the base making the decisions. When we're talking about new democracy, we're talking about socialism. And so that's a huge difference. The difference of political parties compared to other organizations is that, yes, of course, and that's all forms of political parties, the leadership have a political role, a political leading role. So they are also part there because they have the sharpest, I suppose, understanding of the ideology of that political party in the class. So they have that role as well. But democratic centralism, again, just to repeat, it's democracy at the base and the administration, the application at the center.
Yeah, it's also a very dialectical notion as well, and you can think of it more in terms of the state in general, and this also reflects how countries like China, how their democracy actually works, and how a lot of the other socialist governments work, where you have a large amount of localism, effectively, but then a high degree of centralism, and these two aren't in contradiction; they actually complement each other. One necessitates the other. And you can think of this also in terms of how you deal with monopolies as well, because it's like there's a libertarian strain that is I am sympathetic to people who don't like the government, and I'm sympathetic to that, But at the same time, it's an irony, because if you don't have a strong government, suddenly you're just ruled by financial institutions, which is not any better. So you need a way to a sort of a strong apparatus that's able to discipline and effectively crack down on those monopolies. You can't let them just rule, which is what we have now, where we have So I think that's an interesting kind of. I think it's the way that they describe it as democratic dictatorship, which is it sounds like completely contradictory, but if you think about it in terms of just as Joe put it, democratic decision making at the base, and then centralism in practice, in execution. It makes complete sense.
I think I just want to touch on something that he also talks about, where he says if there's no, so he's describing how China must now adopt a system of people's congresses from the National People's Congress down to the provincial, county, district, and townships people's congresses and so on, with all levels electing their respective governmental bodies. And to some extent, we could say, well, Australia has that. We go to the polls and we vote for our government, and then, we vote for our state government, and then we also vote for our municipal governments. But what he then does go on to say is, but if there's to be proper representation for each revolutionary class according to its status in the state, a proper expression of the people's will, a proper direction for revolutionary struggles, then it doesn't really mean anything. And I think that's what we've got today. There isn't. We've got the elements of it. We've got the system that says that it's democratic, but at the same time, we don't really have the representation, and we don't have the participation of all of the people in that process. Sure, going to the polls every 4 years is our participation in that process, but it doesn't go any deeper than that. And really, to get to have a new democratic system, we have to have one where the people are fully involved in that process, not just going to the polls every 3 or 4 years. And so I thought that was that's a really good point that he makes in there as well.
Yeah, 100%, Helen. I heard someone put it that, like, the way it works in parliamentarian systems is that you vote every 4 years for a new dictatorship, and then in the time they have in office, they can just do whatever they want, and then you vote the next 4 years. So it's like, and you're right, and I think that something that we have to also look at is also the local government, the municipal, where that's way more important in these socialist governments than it is here. Whereas the role of the local government is totally disconnected from the state government. There's no it's not. We don't treat it. We treat them as like three completely separate spheres, rather than being kind of an upward direction. So the local then is what elects the state, which then elects the national, which is sort of how it works. It's like it's vertical democracy versus like this sort of like dissipated, like separated spheres. I'm trying to like think of the way to phrase it better, but like there is like the verticality, which has at its base the local, is far more democratic than the sort of what we have when we have the these totally disconnected spheres of parliament.
And just to elaborate on what you're saying, Nada, is that of course it costs the taxpayers, twice as much money in terms of having state government and then federal government, and they don't really actually work together. They're working separately, then it costs them twice as much.
Yeah.
Comrades, can you excuse me for a minute? I'm just going to go shut something. I think we've got a thunderstorm coming over. I'll back it.
Yep. Yeah. I just mentioned something on that. I think on that statement you said, Nada, before, as Mark said, we get a choice every few years to vote for that section of the bourgeoisie who will misrepresent us. And the fact is, I think China's presidency, in an interview recently on democracy, when he compared, he said, you lot, you get, yes, sure, you get to vote, you get a ballot every few years, but then the politicians don't want to know you. There is no recall if they do the wrong thing. They're not interested. Except when an election campaign time comes, they say, we'll give you this and we'll give you that. And as soon as election day's finished, they forget about it. And what he said, that's no democracy. A democracy means that you are allowed to participate not only on election day, but every day of the year in making those decisions and being involved in their application.
It's also like, I think also a way that it was phrased to me, because just to get, I think Helen mentioned how when we think of the word democracy, we just think of the sort of like Western liberal democracy, and I think it's important to remember like what the root of linguistic, or what the root of the word democracy is, which is demos, which is that the people. You know, it's very like, and to me, like it's ruled by the people in some way. So, I think that when we think about we do think about these things, it's like, should we ruled by the people, or should we ruled by a couple of politicians in Canberra? Like, is that ruled by the people really, or is it? I don't know. I think it's an interesting point.
Yeah,
and I think, sorry, Joe, I just want to chuck one more thing in there, and that there is, representative democracy, which is what we live under, and then there is participatory democracy, and participatory democracy is exactly what it says: people participating in the democracy at all levels. Whereas representative democracy, we vote for somebody to represent us once every 4 years, and be done with it, and that's our role in democracy. So I think more and more people now are starting to talk about participatory democracy, even down to things like committee meetings, and there's a whole lot of material coming out about how to organize a meeting properly so that it's participatory and not just a meeting, one-way consultation. So more and more we're starting to see that the type of democracy that we have is very shallow. The representative democracy is very shallow, and it represents only one class, generally speaking.
Yeah, and part of the sort of the ideology to promote this so-called representative, because I don't think it's even that very effectively, this thing about, the Greeks invented it. In actual fact, there was no Greece then, it was Athens. But the system in Athens that was called democratic was a system where more than half of the population was slaves. Women had absolutely no rights. They were considered the property of the bloke. And you had a caste of people. Yes, they got plenty of say. They didn't have to work. They just had to put togas on and hang around the Acropolis making a lot of pretty words, philosophy and talking about mathematics and things like that, which, they made some contributions in that respect. But they had other people to feed them, to do the work for them, to feed them, to clean the house for them, etc. And it was actually, when that system was invented and implemented in Greece, it actually was far less democratic than what existed before.
And actually, too, I just want to add too.
Finish on that. It was the beginning of class rule. Yeah.
And I just want to actually add into that as well. Even if you look at feudal times, and I know a lot of people will quote back to the Magna Carta, and we actually studied this in Peru Libre, how reactionary it is. It's not pro-people at all, and that. But that was actually designed for very wealthy barons and the church to have a lot more to stop the king from completely getting its way, and that's all it was. The people, common people like ourselves, which would have been serfs and peasants and what else, had no rights at all. Really, in that sense, under that system. So we didn't have a say on how the system was run or nothing like that. So that's something to take in consideration. You can see how things advanced over times, but conditioned to themselves to the particular means of productions, from slave society, like you mentioned, the one in Athens, to the ones and Rome as well, but also under feudalism as well, both in Britain, France, and elsewhere in Europe at the same time, and elsewhere around the world. So it's something. Then we're into capitalism with representative democracy. But mind you, that representative democracy didn't happen overnight either. That took a long series of struggles. I mean, for our struggle here in Australia, I mean, there was no. It was only after Eureka and the Goldfields Rebellions that first of all, we got male suffrage for males that did not own property or anything, because by then the only people who had a say in a vote were the landed squattocracy, the ones who actually settled and kind of stole the land, along with the military top brass and all the toffs and everyone else who were very, very, very wealthy. But even most common people, they didn't. And so even that, and then it took at least another close to 50 years, I think, before women got there was women's suffrage as well. They got the vote. So, and in the UK, funny enough, I didn't know this. It was only, I think, around about, I think it was 1916, 1917 that women were finally granted the vote. I didn't know that. Well, it was only recently, I think George Galloway mentioned it or something like that. So there it comes to show, when they're saying about, Australia being this great bastion and institution of democracy, wrong, because actually at the end of the day, it wasn't like that at all. And we've still actually got that a long way to go. When people are talking about freedom and democratic rights and all that, well, things are imposed on us from top to bottom. Where we don't, we've listened to what you say, but we've come up with this completely crazy idea and we're going to implement it, whether you like it or not. And that's really, to me, that's not democracy at all. We don't control the outcome with that as well. And that's all tied up with a system of profits in command under the capitalist system, where they're dictating dictating the outcome, not us. Just so to continue further, what we'll do chapter 6. Joe, did you just want to read it, because it's only just a bit over a page? You're on mute at the moment. Then we'll continue on the discussion.
The economy of new democracy. If such a republic is to be established in China, it must be a new democratic, and not only in its politics, but also in its economy. It will own the big banks and the big industrial and commercial enterprises. Enterprises such as banks, railways, and airlines, whether Chinese-owned or foreign-owned, which are either monopolistic in character or too big for private management, shall be operated and administered by the state, so that private capital cannot dominate the livelihood of the people. This is the main principle of the regulation of capital. This is another solemn declaration of the manifesto of the Kuomintang's First National Congress, held during the period of Kuomintang Communist cooperation. It is the correct policy for the economic structure of the new democratic republic. In the new democratic republic, under the leadership of the proletariat, the state enterprises will be of a socialist character and will constitute the leading force in the whole national economy. But the republic will neither confiscate capitalist property in general, nor forbid the development of such capitalist productions as does not dominate the livelihood of the people. For China's economy is still very backward. The republic will take certain necessary steps to confiscate the land of the landlords and distribute it to those peasants having little or no land. Carry out Dr. Sun Yat-sen's slogan of land to the tiller, abolish the feudal relations in the rural areas, and turn the land over to the private ownership of the peasants. A rich peasant economy will be allowed in the rural areas. Such is the policy of equalization of land ownership. Land to the tiller is the correct slogan for this policy. In general, socialist agriculture will not be established at this stage through various types of cooperatives. Enterprises developed in the basis of land to the tiller will contain elements of socialism. China's economy must develop along the path of the regulation of capital and the equalization of land ownership, and must never be privately owned by a few. We must never permit the few capitalists and landlords to dominate the livelihood of the people. We must never establish a capitalist society of the European American type or allow the old semi-feudal societies to survive. Whoever dares go counter to this line of advance will certainly not succeed, but will run into a brick wall. Such are the internal economic relations which a revolutionary China, a China fighting Japanese aggression, must and necessarily will establish. Such is the economy of new democracy. And the politics of new democracy are the concentrated expression of the economy of new democracy.
Okay, we'll open up discussion on that.
Very good.
Mm.
So I think that poses an interesting, an interesting question for what type of new democracy what type of new economy will our new democracy have?
Yeah, particularly this thing of the state ownership of the banks and the big industrial commercial enterprises, but that's definitely a given. There is also, I mean, it's interesting to note how big of a point the peasantry question is as well with land ownership. Obviously here we don't have a agrarian peasantry, but we also still have, and we have a big agribusiness. And he mentions a socialist, was it a socialist agriculture? That is something that we should be in a position to, like Australia should be in a position to establish, particularly when it comes to the large monopolies, the duopolies, called Woolworths duopolies. Because the tendency of monopolization is actually just the first step towards socialism, really, in terms of socializing that which is already monopolized and developed into big industry, into advanced agriculture. And this is also a necessity from the position of ecology as well, in terms of managing, because this is a huge contradiction in the Murray-Darling Basin between, in terms of the management of these, you have these private firms who are these private large big agribusiness which are not in harmony with the rest of the wider ecology, the wider agricultural space in the Murray-Darling Basin. And it leads to constant conflicts between north and south, where the north of the Murray-Darling system is in constant antagonism with the south, which is largely which is downstream. So the question of socialist agriculture is definitely relevant for us, because I think it doesn't necessarily mean also socialist agriculture also doesn't necessarily mean like state owned, because we have the example of the kolkhozes, the cooperative enterprises in the Soviet Union, where it's not quite state, but it's not fully private either. They're cooperative enterprises. So there's a lot of different models that we can look at in terms of how we should like structure our agrarian as well as our industrial economies when it comes to the new democracy. And it's also really good to note how he says that the politics of the new democracy are the concentrated expression of the economy of the new democracy. And that's a really important point as well, because they are a good reflection of it. So
also, too, I like to. There's a couple of points I want to raise. I mean, we've got to understand on socialism, not everything's nationalised. Well, we're not interested in, the corner shop is not going to be nationalised, or the restaurant, or the mum and dad small farm, or the small business or medium business. But what's important is like the large land scale. When we're talking about agriculture here and land reform, I think actually this is the second point I want to raise. The first people, the First Nations, have to be involved in that as well. Because, I mean, we were talking about that yesterday when we launched the Australians for a New Democracy. And I most want to put it out because the struggle came out about land rights and land reform. And this is where they're instrumental in part of this. So we're talking about big agriculture, big multinationals moving in agriculture is where the First Peoples can be very heavily involved in that struggle to take that back, and they can actually help collectivise that land, and needs to develop that and develop that further as well. And I think that's something we've got to that's got to be incorporated into the discussion as well. So I mean, it's obviously a very big issue. You mentioned about the water. I think something about it's always been a problem. We've got the 4 states that run it: Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia. That whole Murray-Darling Basin, and then you've got a federal government. And I won't get into the whole complexities of who should be running it and who shouldn't be, but there's no harmony between all the levels there. There's got to be that consistent harmony as well, and understand water. The water needs a natural flow. At the same time, there's got to be that harmony with the land, but also too the level of people managing it, from the farmers to whoever else at the same time, and then respective governments, because that doesn't seem to be. They all seem to be gearing up for providing all that water for the big multinationals. It's all there to make profit out of, and hence why we've got these problems in the first place. So when we had an intense drought like we did over 2 years ago, you looked at the Darling River, there was no flow in it whatsoever. In fact, it was bone dry in many places, including the Menindee Lakes. got water in it now. This is even that under a Ted Drought, there would be still water in there to sustain it. So all these things are balancing. It can be actually properly taken into account instead of under the current system where we're talking about lip service to environment with lip service to that. Oh, we'll talk about carbon credits here and government there, but all they're doing is making the problems worse, not making it better at all.
Because they don't want to change the way things are. I mean, in this, I see a couple of key things. One is, yes, the need to take control of key industries and key infrastructure, key resources. But just as important is here is the statement says, no, we're not talking about confiscating all capital, which implicates there'd be quite a bit of it not confiscated. I think it's not here, but in other places you can see, well, unless they act against us, and this is, unless they're actively taking the side of the enemy, then we'll have to do something about it. But if we look at agriculture here, for instance, and I'd say, what Nada said is really true. And if we look back, I remember when the big agribusiness were first, they were known as the Collins Street farmers. But the reason is that the owners of this land, of this agriculture, never left the city. But now it's gone past that. They're not in Collins Street. They're in New York and London mainly. And, the big companies like Monsanto have been making huge moves in. And they're actually destroying the agriculture that it was. Not only the farmers who depended on it, who were often families, but what they actually did on the land. We've got the example in the Hunter of the growing of cotton and rice in places they shouldn't be, because they're diverting all the water, and the contradiction between them and the cattle industry. Now, I've been in the past when they were having Big Blue in contact with the cattle industry, and I'll tell you what, some of those big cattle farmers, cattle ranchers, were actually becoming very sympathetic to the ideas of socialism. They were talking about it amongst themselves because they saw that they were screwing their livelihood, and they were the ones who started seeking through the trade union movement some support from the working class, and were actually talking about, they were traveling 500 kilometers to go to a meeting. It's incredible stuff because that's how far it was from anyone. So that's just one example. You had a magnificent battle in Victoria with the dairy farmers at one stage, who had an alliance with the Builders Labourers Federation, who were up there. I know about it because I was involved in actually printing their material, getting it, or helping to write it out and having their material printed. And great, they were coming along the same way. They were starting to see that in their meetings, they were talking about the necessary unity between themselves and the working class. So we've got that. And some of them were quite big farmers, on paper, they were millionaires or multimillionaires. Of course, they weren't really, because they didn't have that money in the bank. But on paper, they were.
Actually, Joe, I just want to throw a little out note here. When I was mentioning, talking to the secretary today, Bendigo Trades Hall, he actually stipulated something very interesting with foreign ownership of our land. The biggest foreign ownership is actually British. That's right. When people talk about China, China's on a leasehold, and that's about 1.2% all total land. But it's British is the main predominantly thing. Just a little bit of a interesting fun fact there for everybody and the audience.
Well, on that, to put a couple of numbers on it, the British at the current, well, that was 2 years ago, so I presume it's pretty similar now. Own 16% of Australia's landmass. That's followed by the United States,
correct,
which owns 12%.
Yep.
There's another country which owns just about the same much.
Japanese, I think.
No, it's not Japan. It's one of the
European.
European
Okay, well, I'll stand corrected there.
It's Germany or France. I'm not sure which one. but there's a number of European countries that own a little bit. In comparison, all total holdings under what's classified as Chinese entities is just under 3%, or was 2 years ago.
Yeah,
One of the top ones is Singapore. Singapore owns quite a bit of land, and when you're talking Singapore, you're largely talking about one family. It's Singapore is virtually a corporation of the Lee family. So when you got that, you replicate that in other parts. And the research has been done over, and that was 30 years ago, that most industries, two or three companies controlled 80% of nearly every industry in Australia. If I go one which is particularly nasty in terms of ideology, and that is media and culture. One of the most, two of the most monopolised industries around, and Australia is perhaps it's got a reputation of perhaps being the most monopolised economy on this planet.
Helen or Nada, did you just want to add anything else?
Well, sorry.
Helen first, Nada. Sorry.
No, go, Helen.
I was just going to draw attention to that issue of the banks but I've kind of lost the manuscript. I'm online looking at the manuscript, but just drawing attention to the fact that the banks will be owned by and any main large corporations that can't manage their industry, that they will come under the control of the people or the people's government. And I think that's important, because while we won't be nationalising, or a socialist government won't be nationalising everything, there will be some things that will automatically, almost immediately, come under the control of the people. And I think the banking system is going to be one of those things.
Could I add in this? It's also that part of the economy that's not nationalising, with the political element, that also operates under the supervision of the popular power.
Yeah. I don't really have much else to say other than I think any new democratic movement in Australia has to emphasise the need to expropriate the foreign-owned land in this country. And that's got to be a central part of any kind of program. Who was going to read next? I can if you need to.
Helen's next.
Helen's next? Okay.
I'm just looking at the time, thinking.
Yeah, same here. Yeah, I was
might want to finish on that.
Yeah, so comments. I know we were going to talk about read through chapter 7. That's about roughly about 4 pages. But how about we hold it here tonight? It's been an hour and a half already, I think, and we can read the next 2 chapters in 2 weeks' time, which I think is February the 10th. I was just so it's a fortnight from now. It gives us time, because actually there's 2 great chapters coming up. It's refutation of bourgeois dictatorship, but also refutation of left phrasemongering. So I'll be looking forward to that. I'll be looking.
I particularly like the second one.
Yeah, so we'll get on to that, because we do it. We just are aware of time. But so far it's been a great discussion kicking off the year, and excellent material to work from. And so far it actually really broadens. Just to actually make it just summarise tonight. Works on Miles Tung, I mean, they're very equivalent, very good, easy understanding read. He's done some excellent work, especially on contradictions in philosophy. I highly recommend reading that as well. 4 and 5 of philosophy, and also on contradictions. It's certainly good. But so a lot of this stuff, it was really written out through actual experience and observation himself. So, and there's certain things we can apply here today. And obviously, it's been a big mind opener to actually understand, to sort of broaden out, to have this, instead of having this narrow view of what democracy is, to actually broaden out. Well, it's not this narrow view of what we've been used to being growing up with and taught at school and through the media. So I looked at, and so I like to thanks to comrades tonight. Unless you guys got any finishing remarks, and we'll wind up tonight.
Yeah, I'll just say it's been great, and hopefully, I know for me, going back, I have read this, but not for a long time before. But it's a good way to refresh and really draw the attention to some of the things that are the important issues that we need to be all looking at.
Yeah. So, all right. So, all right, for all those viewers out there, yes, it'll be our Thursday here in Australia, 7 p.m. on Thursday, 10th of February, Australian Eastern Daylight Time. Look, once again, I thank you, and also too, I'd like to thank James for his commentary about in Scotland there in Scottish rivers and fisheries, we've got armies of NGOs, charities, trusts, and foundations on top of owners/occupiers, management, and government. Nightmare. I couldn't agree with you more there, James. What a complete.
It sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it?
Funny. It sounds familiar to us here too. So yeah, you guys in Scotland are not alone. But at least take comfort in that. Well, look, thank you, comrades. Thank you, Joe, Helen, and Nada for tonight, and thank you for everyone else tuning in. And also too, for those of you who will be watching this later on, you might be overseas and because it could be the early hours of the morning and decide to watch this later on. Thank you. But look, I will ask you to please subscribe, please like it, please share far and wide with other people, and also feel free to shoot us any questions anytime. And if you wish to actually be involved, feel free to let us know either through the new website, Australians for New Democracy, or through the chat session. You can email us as well, and we'll move and keep moving on. So. Thank you, and I'll finish it off there with Workers of All Countries Unite. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.